two grocery stores, and I was sort of like managing one of them. And I was working in the store, just as the manager, the clerk. It was a fairly small store, but I started going to Boston University, College of Business Administration, and I'd work in the store during the day and manage the store, and then go to school at night. Then I was drafted to go into the Army, but I didn't want to go into the Army, so I had a professor at BU, where I was going to school, who was a lieutenant in the Coast Guard Reserve. So I spoke to him about it, and he said, well, come down and I'll see if I can recruit you, enlist you in the Coast Guard. So he did. And so I joined the United States Coast Guard. I left home for the first time in my life, really, that I was away from home. And I went to Manhattan Beach, New York, which is part of Brooklyn, for training. It was at Manhattan Beach Training Center, and I was there for 6 weeks. I went through the routine of learning how to shoot a rifle and just, whatever military training they give you. And then I was shipped out, and I went to Port Aransas, Texas, and there was a big naval air station there. It was about they had about 5,000 air cadets there training how to fly airplanes, fighter planes. But I was attached to a beach patrol unit, and I lived in a sort of a Quonset hut out on a beach way behind sand dunes, about 60 miles from Port Aransas itself. You had to go down by jeep back and forth on the beach. And my responsibility was to, myself and another fellow would go out on the beach every night with a rifle and a dog. We each had our own rifles and a dog. And the idea was to look at the coastline to spot any lights, because it potentially could be a submarine or whatever. And if there was, then we were supposed to notify the headquarters. And we never did see anything ever, all the time I was there. So then I developed an ear infection. I used to do a lot of diving into the ocean, and I developed an ear infection, and it's called otitis media. And they put me in a naval hospital in Corpus Christi. I was there for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then we were transferred to San Diego, California, to the Coast Guard Air Station on North Island, which is part of San Diego. And I was just a ground person. I was not an engineer or a technician. I was just regular ground crew people. And although I used to go flying with the guys quite a bit, just hop on a plane and just fly around. I was there for probably another year or so. And then we got assignments to be shipped out to sea duty. We were going to be transferred onto a destroyer escort, which is a small version of a destroyer. It's like a patrol boat. So what happened is I went for a physical, and I did not pass because the infection in my ear had left some damage, I guess. So they rejected me. They requested that I be honorably discharged at San Diego, which I was, and then they gave me a certificate of discharge and told me to go home. So what I did then is I actually hitchhiked all across the country. I went all across to about St. Louis, then I went down to Texas, then I went back up. Then I bought a ticket from a guy down there who had a railroad ticket. Veterans could buy tickets for next to nothing, for $5 he sold me a ticket from New Orleans back to Boston. And so I took it and I came home.
I grew up in Schenectady, which is a wonderful city for a young unmarried woman to live in, because the General Electric Company was there, and there were lots of engineers and lots of accountants. So it was easy to get dates because there weren't enough girls to go around. And so I had a date with one of the young engineers, and we went on an airplane ride. Flew around Schenectady and Troy and Albany and Lake George. And when I came home, I said to my father, how come I don't know anybody else who flies an airplane? And I didn't. So he said, absolutely to my amazement, that why don't you learn how to fly? And then I decided, why not? And after I had learned how to fly, my father said, well, and he was telling a lie because I don't think it was true. He said my grandmother had left me $2,000 when she died. And so and he said, why don't you buy an airplane? Which I did. And I had a little Cub coupe named Red Wing. It was a red side-by-side seat. This was just before the war, and there were civilian air patrols, and we flew around and pretended that you couldn't get into Schenectady because the bridges were all down. And we'd fly missions across the river and drop messages and stuff like that.
Now, there weren't a lot of women pilots in those days.
Well, there were a lot more than you think. There were 45,000 women pilots who got this letter from Jacqueline Cochran urging them to join the organization that she was starting, which was called the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And so it was wartime, and I could fly an airplane. And I figured fewer women could fly an airplane than could teach in kindergarten. So I volunteered and joined the WASPs and went to Sweetwater, Texas. We went to Sweetwater to learn to fly Army planes, and we got the same training that the soldiers got. And the reason we were thought to be needed was that the men flyers were all having to go overseas, and they didn't know how many of them would come back. And they thought if we could teach the women to fly the airplanes, that would be all to the good. And we had to march and do all the military. And we lived in what they called bays. And at that time, I was 28 years old and not very happy to live as if I was in summer camp. You know, 6 of us to a bay. And the field was called Mather Field, outside of Sacramento. And I learned to fly the B-25, which needed 2 pilots. And interestingly enough, I met the woman that I became fondest of and knew about better than anybody else there was our co-pilot, because her name was Landry and mine was Lafevre. So we were just paired. And she was a wonderful pilot. And And I don't think I was. I think all I had going for me was that I was well coordinated and I could pass all the flying tests. But I didn't love it the way most all the other women did. I didn't really enjoy flying, but it was wartime. And I had two brothers. One was in the Navy and the other in the Army. And so I thought it was the place to be. I was assigned to a tow target squadron, which towed targets for the anti-aircraft soldiers to practice shooting at. But the target was a mile behind, and they didn't really come close to the airplane, except I'm told that one of them hit a plane, but not mine. At that point, it was early in 1944. I mean, I'd been there a year in the total program, and my father was dying, and so I decided to go to the commanding officer. And since we were volunteers, only being hired by the Army, I could quit, which I didn't want to really, but I decided at that same time my younger brother was killed. 44, my father did die, and I was home, and that was good. Though I had to lie to him because we had always been brought up to stick with what we started. And I lied to him. I told him I had gotten a leave of absence. So I was home when he died. And then I stayed home. And then eventually I went back to teaching and got married. And that's it. And I never wanted to fly again. I never was, even before with my own little airplane, I wasn't thrilled by flying. I was more thrilled by teaching kindergartners. And that's what I did, and I continued to teach, taking time off to have two children, and then went back to teaching again and taught until 1973, and then retired. I've gotten a lot of credit for being a pilot in World War II that I don't deserve, really, because I was successful, but I was really not a great pilot, I don't think. But a friend here at Newbury Court the other day was talking about how wonderful it was, and I said, well, I wish people would realize that it was only 1/90th of my life, 1 year out of 90, and I've gotten a lot more credit for that than for what my real calling was, and that was teaching small children. But that's the way life is.
Well, I was in Everett High School in Everett, Massachusetts during the early part of the war years. And in 1944, when many of my buddies in the class before me had gone into the service, in 1944 when I graduated from high school, a week later I was in the United States Navy. I was trained to be a radio operator, and then from there was assigned to a troop transport out of, I believe it was San Pedro, California. For the spring of 1945, when things were still pretty heavy in the South Pacific, and during the time of our going over, got word that the war in Germany, Europe, had ended. And we were assigned to the 7th Fleet and on our way to the Philippines to began moving troops from there up into Okinawa in preparation for the invasion of Japan at that time. That's what we were assigned to do. Our ship was assigned to pick up some Japanese prisoners of war. When we got to the place where we were to pick them up, we anchored about a mile or two offshore, sent personnel to meet with the other U.S. military that was on the island with the prisoners. So we sent in some medics and some communication people. And being an operator, we would be the ones that would somehow or other begin to get information back and forth. There was a signal to our ship, and the message was, have located the prisoners and those who were holding them. And amongst the prisoners, there were 16 stretcher cases, await orders. And so one of the radio operators took the message to the officer of the day. And about a half an hour later, the message went back to the signal bridge, so we weren't aware of what was being sent. But we, from our ship, heard gunshots from the beach. And to my amazement anyhow, and we didn't talk a whole lot about it then, but it's something that really hit me terribly hard at that moment, because there were no stretcher cases brought aboard our ship. And you know, I had just crossed the international date line somewhere in there and had two 19th birthdays. So I was a pretty young guy having to have that kind of experience. We all went into the war that we were right and they were wrong, and somehow or other that was not quite right to have that kind of thing happen. So that haunted me all the rest of my time in the Navy. At one point, I spoke to my communications officer and just said how difficult a time I was having. Just doing what I was doing as a radio operator. And being involved in the war. I mean, that experience just hung in there with me. And we made it to the Philippines and then arrived at Okinawa sometime early summer. And remember the experience of during the time we were there, we were involved in 2 typhoons. And ships of the size of the ship I was on were told to pull up anchor and ride the storm out at sea. The largest ships were sent to sea and the smaller ones were kept in the harbor. And that was an amazing experience, because I can remember times in the radio shack, literally during the storm, having the typewriter, and you were copying messages coming in, having the typewriter literally above your head. And we'd ride out. Rode out 2 typhoons in about 2 or 3 days each that we did that. And then I'm not quite sure how long after those, but we were still anchored, unloaded our troops, and somewhere in there is when the kamikazes began their nightly suicide bombing in just off Yellow Beach in Okinawa. And the harbor was full of ships. And what we were to do when we learned through the radio shack, being a radio operator, when a plane would leave its base and when it would be ready to make its dive. I mean, we were getting that kind of information fairly regularly. And as soon as we heard that they had left their base, wherever it was, the ships, the larger ships particularly, would launch a small boat over the side and then smoke the ship in. They had smoke bombs, and they'd go around the ship, and so that every large ship in the harbor would be covered in by smoke, so they couldn't be seen by any approaching planes. So then, when that was done, we would just sit there aboard ship, and a young fellow and myself were our battle station. It was just a small radio room back on the fantail of the ship behind the big 16-inch gun. It would fire off every once in a while just out into the sky, and we would sit in this room to wait for an explosion. And we never knew where the planes were going to hit. You'd just sit there knowing they're coming in through the cloud of smoke, and either going to just hit the water or hit ships. And that went on for, I don't know how many days now. It just seems like a big dream. But every night there would be these suicide planes just coming and literally bombing. And we ended up being one of the fortunate ones that just didn't get hit. But planes in the morning, when the smoke would clear, and we'd look around and would see the hulks of burning ships scattered across the harbor who had been hit during the night. So then we began hearing messages on radio that there was something planned that was going to be of a something quite major, and this was all the implications of leading up to the dropping of the atomic bomb. We were never told what it was going to be, but the morning that the planes left Tinian Island, I believe that's where they were launched from, sometime later in the day, we got word what had happened, that we had dropped this massive bomb on Hiroshima, and we began intercepting radio communication even from those who were on the plane. And it was clear that those who were involved in flying the plane that dropped the atomic bomb were not aware of the extent of what it was they did either. It was just flabbergasted. Well, through all of this stuff that was going on for me during the war, I was finding myself asking the question, what am I going to do when I get out? I mean, I didn't take any preparation for college in high school. I was planning to be a bookkeeper and probably become an accountant, and somewhere down the road maybe a CPA, and had been working in a bank in high school. But I began to ask, because I was so bothered by the whole notion of war, could I do something more significant than being an accountant? I grew up in the church and began to raise questions about the possibility of the ministry, but how could I do that? I had no way to get into college. But this is, and it was really the announcement of the atomic bomb, and then a few days later, the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki. Pretty well decided that I was going to give going into the ministry my best shot, and I would find out how I could do that. I don't think I've ever told this story since I got out, but when I got discharged in Jacksonville, Florida, the person who was discharging me said, now your base when you get out of the service now, where you will be the Fargo building in Boston. That's where you'll be able to be in the reserves. And you just have to go there something like twice a month and 2 weeks out of the year, but you stay in the Navy Reserves. And I can still say, looking at this guy, I said, look, when I get out of this uniform, nobody's ever going to see me in a military uniform again. So forget the reserve. So that's where I was when I came out of the war. So, and that's where I still am pretty much. So.